On this week's Alex Salmond Show, some of the highlights of our international programmes from the last year. We find out what's the most contented society on earth, why the Prime Minister of Malta has resigned despite the island's economic success, and how we made a very special man very happy by telling the story of Lancastria. Watch the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show on Thursday, the 12th of December, Election Day in the United Kingdom, where we're not allowed to broadcast anything about UK politics, save that the polls are open until 10 p.m.
So I thought it'd be fun if we looked at some of the highlights of our international shows. Last summer we were in Malta, looking at the rise of the small country's economy over the last 15 years. And I spoke to Dr. Lawrence Gonzi, the former Prime Minister, the man who led Malta into Europe. I'm interested in economics because successfully joined the euro, sustained Malta, recovered very quickly from the financial crisis. And you embarked on a number of fairly ambitious infrastructure projects to transform the base of the economy, but they didn't prove altogether popular. I mean, the Valletta project, tell us a bit about that, what your vision was, and why it wasn't, as you might think, greeted with open arms by people.
Yes, well, Valletta being the capital city of Malta, but not just a capital city. It is a symbol in itself. Valletta was the city where the Knights of Malta, 300 years ago, placed their headquarters over there, designed by them to be a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen, is the phrase that was used at the time. But anyway, Valletta, it's a bit of history. And I remember I said, this is a symbol which needs to be upgraded. It needs to make a statement. Valletta needs to make a statement of Malta as it is today and as it should be in the future, its role in the Mediterranean, its role in Europe, its values, what it presents, etc. And the best way I could do that was to build an imposing building in the entrance to Valletta, which made a statement. And the building would be a new parliament. Of course, when the architect chosen was Renzo Piano, one of the most famous architects in the world, and I had persuaded him, and I'm very proud of it, to come and make a design, and he presented the design. All hell broke loose. All hell broke loose. And there was debate about the building, about the cost, about the design, about this, about that, etc. So the whole island was divided. Actually, a little bit more than divided. But I was determined to make that statement. And it had been something which everybody agreed upon at the end of the day, that Valletta needed something to be restructured, reformed, etc. But nobody agreed on what. And it had been a debate for so many years. Anyway, I was determined, I did that. And today, everybody is so proud of this project that even those who criticized it in a vicious way, today, if you go into their website, you will see their own picture with a smiling face, and the background is this blessed building. And I'm so proud of that. And in fact, one of the things which makes me really happy is I walk into Valletta. I make it a point to walk into Valletta practically every day.
You know, when you started out in your political career, did you think it was possible that Malta would transition from where it was, as effectively an imperial possession, into a proud and equal independent state within the European country?
Very much so, Alex. Joining the EU meant that for us, meant not only that we could make all this and find our place around the table where decisions are taken, but it also opened up enormous resources, financial resources, that helped us move up the level of standard of quality of life that Europe accepts as the standard. We started off as an objective one country. We are no longer an objective one country. You know, thanks to also the funds that were available to us, which otherwise would not have been available to Malta.
And did you look at any of the models of the smaller countries? I mean, Luxembourg or Ireland? I mean, obviously, Malta isn't Ireland, Ireland isn't Malta, but there are some similarities in the transition of the economy.
Oh, yes, and Ireland was a model. Luxembourg was another model. We looked at Luxembourg and we realized that the success of Luxembourg, small country, population very similar to Malta's, 400,000 thereabouts, but their focus on the economy was financial services. We looked at it again, Ireland, the Irish tiger. You remember this phrase that was used at the time? And we were looking at what was the secret. How did Ireland manage to transform its economy from what that was basically very much agriculture-based into a completely modern one? So we had the benefit of looking at what were the opportunities. Then decisions were taken to invest heavily in the technology, in the infrastructure, in the use of data and IT as fundamental building blocks. In the meantime, investing in our human resources to have the right people in the right place. And there you have basically the formula of our success.
What a nice man Dr. Gonzi is. We particularly like his story about the Libyan jets landing at the airport. Let's have a look at that.
I was at my office in Castile. I remember it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon or thereabouts. Anyway, I got this telephone call from our airport officials there telling me, Prime Minister, we've got a problem. I mean, very unusual for somebody to phone directly the Prime Minister. Yeah. You know, and they said 2 Mirage jets have just landed in our single airport. This is the only airport where our tourists land all the time, etc. I suddenly pictured all these international flights landing in Malta and seeing these 2 Mirage jets parked in the middle of the runway. And I said, well, move them out of the way. And I said, no, we're not going to touch them because these jet planes are armed to the teeth. And the advice we've been given by technicians that, I mean, if we touch anything that's wrong, the whole thing could blow up. Oh, my goodness. Today I laugh about it, but at the time I remember
it's a tricky
situation.
Of course, it has to be said there is a darker side to Malta's soaraway economic success. We took up that issue in our second programme on Malta. Of course, economic success brings with it its own challenges. And the first is whether economic expansion is sustainable in this crowded island with rapid growth and population expansion. The second is, does economic progress throw out a wider disparity between the rich and the poor? And thirdly, the murder in 2017 of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia threw into sharp relief where a flood of dirty money was in danger of undermining the political fabric of the Maltese Islands. The arguments from the opposition and from newspapers, critics about corruption in government, is that another sign or byproduct of economic success? If there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system, is that? Would you put it down to that?
Look, there are several accusations of corruption which are very worrying, and we keep hearing this on a daily basis. The Panama Papers exposed certain senior people involved in some very dodgy business. And what happens is you get to a stage where now people are saying, okay, fine, those people are corrupt, but I still have money in my pocket, which is quite a worrying thing to see in my own country.
Having said that, I mean, if you take a world index of civil liberties, Malta ranks very highly. I mean, Malta's up there in the top 20 in terms of efficiency of government, in terms of pluralism of the system, in terms of freedom of the press. So perhaps the many other countries in the world would envy the degree of freedom there is in Malta.
To a certain extent. Remember, since Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist, was killed 2 years ago, things have changed here. So yes, there is the freedom of the press. We are free to report whatever we want, and I have no problem with that. The censorship comes in different ways. The censorship comes in me asking legitimate questions to the government and not getting any replies.
And in the last 2 weeks, this whole issue has provoked the dramatic downfall of Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, despite the economic success of Malta. However, we also took the time to take a brief look at the turbulent history of these Maltese islands.
Malta, the miracle economy of the Med. As we've seen in the first 2 shows, great changes are afoot in these islands. But these changes are of nothing as to the turbulent history of the Maltese Islands over the last 2,000 years. Successively, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Sicilians, the Ottomans, the French, and then the British all saw the strategic importance of these islands and fought over them. As we sail into the Grand Harbour of the ancient 3 cities of Malta, which withstood the Great Siege of 1565, we can see from these battlements, when the forces of Suleiman the Magnificent arrived, they knew they had the numbers, but they were still going to be in for a fight behind these fortifications. And so it was to prove. Where better to pick up the story of these islands than in the Maritime Museum, because the one constant in Maltese history is the sea. Emmanuel, tell us about this wonderful specimen of Maritime Malta.
So what we've got here, Alex, is a really wonderful object, quite big, as you can see. It's a working model from the late 18th century, and this would have been used by the cadets of the Order of the Knights of St. John.
This is Knights of St. John,
Knights
who
of
for
St.
300 years were basically in charge of this
in
island.
charge of these islands, and of course they are a maritime power above everything else. So they need to train their young ones how to operate the real thing. So this would have been their virtual but real model. Everything works. You can pull the pulleys, raise the sails, move the cannons, so that eventually when you get on board the real thing, you would have had a sense of how it's going to work. And I think it's a beautiful and wonderful object that has miraculously survived and come down to us.
So if Malta was my favourite international shows, what about yourself, Taz?
Well, I liked another one which has become very topical, and that's the feature of the Chagos Islanders. And in particular, will that community, Her Majesty's subjects, cleared from the islands in the 1960s to make way for an American Air Force base, ever get the right to return to their homeland? This was how we introduced the issue. Today we take a well-deserved break from Brexit to visit the sun-kissed beaches of the Indian Ocean. There is one problem with this island paradise. The people have been replaced by an Air Force base. For that has been the fate of the Chagosians, Her Majesty's subjects cleared from their homeland half a century ago to make way for American service personnel. We consider how this bitter legacy of colonialism still impacts today. We look at the human cost of a people cleared from their islands.
Would you say that court ruling against Britain was a step forward?
Yes, it is a step forward to go on our island. And for that to happen, we need to make the Great Britain to realize that they need to honor the rule of the law, because they might as well ignore it, and we do not want that. We want other nations to back up us, back the Chagosian, and as a Chagosian, we need to go home.
And can that sense of belonging only be satisfied when the community returns to your island home?
Of course. That sense of belonging is not here at all. There's no sense of belonging there. It's like we are in a wait. We've been in, for 50 years, we've been in a waiting room. For 50 years, we've been waiting. We've been waiting for, how long can you wait? This is a prison sentence, this is a life sentence, this is a lifelong wait.
So the Chagos Islands are a very long-running and, of course, continuing issue. But what's coming up after the break, Taz?
Well, after the break, we'll talk to that famous campaigner Medea Benjamin about the politics of protest internationally. We also find out what is the most contented society on earth and why this gentleman had one of his favourite days on our show.
I did go to Scotland a couple of times. In fact, they named a loch after me.
What, Loch Ernest?
Loch Ern.
Loch Ern. I'll remember that next time I'm here.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Taz and I are discussing some of the highlights of the international issues we've featured in the last year's series. In our mini-series on the politics of protest, I had the enormous pleasure of speaking to one of the most celebrated campaigners on the planet, Medea Benjamin. I asked Medea if the social media had made this the new age of protest. Are we living through an age of protest? Are we back in 1968? Or is it just the social media amplifying everything that's happening across the world?
I think the protests around the climate are new and are global and are huge and are only going to grow, as this is a planetary issue that affects us all. But then in some other areas, I think we're seeing less. For example, we saw in the Middle East all of the uprisings around the Arab Spring, and that spread from one country to another. But now that it looks like the results of those were not so positive, I think that's put a damper on some other protests in the Middle East, for example. So I think we're constantly seeing ups and downs in protests, but around the climate, this is enormous and will only grow.
Medea Benjamin, you're one of America's most celebrated activists across a range of causes in human rights. How has your own campaigning been affected by the social media age? Do you do things differently now as a result of social media?
Actually, the issues that I am most involved in, which is trying to stop wars, have been harder to organize, not particularly because of the social media age, but just because the wars have become so fuzzy. They've gone on for the last 20 years. It's harder to get people out on the streets. So I think social media can be a key to mobilizing like we see in Hong Kong. But I also think that before social media, we had enormous protests. We had mass protests around civil rights issues in the United States when there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram.
What a remarkable lady. However, I was struck when during our travels, we discovered the world's most contented country was in fact Denmark. Former Mayor of Culture and Leisure for Copenhagen, Pia Allerslev, told us why and how it won that accolade.
Now, you spent 6 years as Mayor of Culture and Leisure here in Copenhagen. How important is the cultural aspect to the vibrancy of a great city like this?
Well, I think the cultural life in Copenhagen is one of the reasons why we have been ranked as one of the best cities in the world. Of course, you need daycare centers, you need great infrastructure and all that, but it's the cultural life, it's the leisure life, it's all the fun things that are important to a city the size of Copenhagen, at least.
And unlike many cities around the world, Copenhagen has kept its skyline and much of the traditional architecture is intact. Has that been a difficult thing to do?
Well, it was actually one of my first political decisions when I became Mayor of Culture and Leisure back in 2008. And the former Lord Mayor, she didn't want to keep the skyline. She wanted to make it possible, if the right project came, that we could just put up a big building right in the center of the city. But a majority of parties decided that no way. We want to keep the skyline, we want to keep what is very important and very special to Copenhagen, but we also wanted to make sure that of course we can build high buildings and spectacular new buildings in the surroundings of the city. But the old city has to remain the old city structure.
Now, Pia, for a visitor to the city like myself, that's wonderful. It's one of the first things you noticed so distinctively about Copenhagen. But of course, with the number of people coming and wanting to come to Copenhagen to stay as a result of the city's success, there must be quite a tension between not being able to build high-rise and accommodating the growing number of people.
Well, but I actually think that most people, they prefer a Copenhagen like this because we're building new, fantastic areas in Copenhagen with new, very modern buildings. I think a lot of people, they would actually not like to live in the old city because you have all the bars, you have all the restaurants, you have all the people in the old city. So the people coming to Copenhagen to live here, they actually want to stay just a kilometer or two away from the center, but still be able to go there and enjoy the life there. So we're building, I don't know, really many apartments right now for new Copenhagen.
Now, that hardly seems like a year ago. But earlier on, you mentioned how we'd made a very special gentleman very happy in our series on Lancastria. Tell us the story, Taz.
Well, the Lancastria was a troop ship lost off Brittany in the early stages of the war. It is the largest maritime disaster in British history, with more lives lost than the Titanic and Lusitania combined.
The greatest naval disaster in British history, where the loss of life was greater than the Titanic, the Lusitania and the Hood combined, is barely remembered at all. For it is here, just a few miles off the port of Saint-Nazaire in Brittany, that on the 17th of June 1940, the Lancastria was sunk with a minimum loss of over 4,000 souls, both civilian and military. And so in two special programmes for Remembrance Day, we chart the history of the Lancastria. We speak to the last few remaining survivors. We speak to the relatives of those who perished and those who survived. We speak to the campaigners about their long struggle for remembrance. And we try to answer the question of why the greatest naval disaster in British history has been confined to the hidden vaults of history. You know, they say the sea is cruel, but perhaps not quite as cruel as those who have denied remembrance to so many for 78 long years. Captain Sharp, in command of Lancastria, received an order from the Admiralty. It told him to load as many men as possible without regard to the limits laid down by maritime law. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, more than 6,000 people, exhausted soldiers, confused refugees, were crowded onto the ship, more than 3 times its established capacity limit. At that point, Captain Sharp made a fateful decision to stay at anchor and not to make a dash for home. He was understandably frightened that without a destroyer escort, his ship would be easy prey to U-boats in the English Channel. Inevitably, as each month passes, there are fewer of the Lancastria survivors alive to give witness to what actually happened on that fateful day of June the 17th, 1940. Even since we've started filming, we have lost 97-year-old Reg Brown, a stalwart of Lancastria commemorations over the years. And therefore today, I'm privileged to be here in Uxbridge to interview Lancastria survivor, Royal Engineer Ernest Beasley, 101 years young.
I did go to Scotland a couple of times. In fact, they named a loch after me.
What, Loch Ernest?
Loch Ern.
Loch Ern. I'll remember that next time I'm here.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at this. Ernest, can I take you back to when you were on board the Lancastria?
Yeah.
The bombs went down the funnel.
That's right.
The ship was packed to the gunwales with people. Were they all soldiers or were there civilians, refugees, other people?
Nearly all soldiers and nurses, and 1 or 2 or 3 there was ordinary people, and they some of them had children with them.
What do you think the key thing to survival was? Was it just your luck? Was it the fact you were a strong swimmer was to your advantage, of course?
Well, it was, yeah.
But some people would stay, some people would
Yeah.
jump, people
but
didn't know what to do.
On the ship, it's sinking, and I thought, well, the shore was about 2 miles away. So I thought, I'd better jump in and swim away. I could swim quite a bit, but I swam for about 20 minutes. Then this Royal Navy corvette come round, and he's heading straight for me, and I shouted, and he stood on the bow, and he slung a rubber raft out, and they went away. So I climbed into the rubber raft, and I'm sitting in there, and all these blokes covered in oil, they all come swimming up. About 6 of them got in with me, like, and the others was hanging on the sides. And I got cramp in my legs, and I had to stand up. I stood up, and they pushed me in the sea.
That was a bit much. You were on the raft first, so you got flung back in because they thought you were going to destabilise the raft,
right.
yes?
Well, so I started to swim towards the shore. I got so far away, and there was a rowing boat come from shore, and he's coming towards me, like, but he can't see me because he's got his back to me, and he comes up, and when he got a bit close, I shouted out, over here, and he looked round, he seen me, and he come over, he said, can you row? I said, yeah. And then out of nowhere come this Royal Naval corvette, and they took us on board. They washed all the oil off of us. And then the other big liner that was there, the Ronsi, and this corvette we was on, he put us all on to the Ronsi, the other ship. And then we set sail for England. We land up in Plymouth, and we were isolated from other people because they didn't want to talk about what had happened. And when I went home and talked to my parents about it, none of them heard anything about it because they were forbidden to put it in a British paper.
But for years afterwards, if you said to somebody, I was on the Lancastria, very few people would know.
They wouldn't know, no. No, they wouldn't, no.
Can I talk about your medals, sir?
Well,
this array of medals here.
Well,
because you served right through the war. I can see the King George medal. Yeah.
yeah, but you see, none of them was to do with the Lancastria. All of these was what happened to me after that.
Would you like to have a medal that signifies the
Do
Lancaster?
you know what? I was going to ask you that. Well,
And it just so happens, sir, that I have one with me. And with great pleasure, sir,
that's
to you,
that's beautiful.
Ernest Beasley,
That's very
the
nice.
Royal Engineers.
Yeah, very.
It's my privilege to present it to you.
That is really nice. I certainly appreciate that. Yeah.
For your service, sir.
And I'm very pleased I'm here to talk to people about it.
And talking so well.
Yeah, oh, that was lovely. I'm so pleased.
It's a privilege.
Well, very sadly, we have to report that Ernest passed away in November this year, but we know for sure that we made a wonderful man very happy to see his service record recognised after all of these years.
Next week, we sum up the election results with our prestigious panel of political pundits. But now for this show, this is how we summed up the story of the Lancastria. And it's here on the banks of the River Clyde that our story has its beginning and its end. This is where the Lancastria was born as the Turhania in 1922. The name was changed a few years later because American guests found it difficult to pronounce. And just a few yards from here is where the Lancastria families finally achieved their heart's desire in 2011 by having a memorial built to those who died. It's difficult not to contrast the open-hearted remembrance of the people of Brittany with the grudging admission of the authorities in these islands. And by denying remembrance, they risk two things. Firstly, if you don't remember war with all its sacrifice and casualties, then you run the risk of repeating the mistake. And secondly, without remembrance, families cannot have finality for the loss of their loved ones. The Lancastria families were denied both. And in 2011, when a requiem for the Lancastria finally arrived, it was a people's requiem. Perhaps Robert Louis Stevenson said it best. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I lay me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home as a sailor, home from the sea, and a hunter, home from the hill.